Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing a review of the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss, which consists of the books The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear. I read these books back to back a few years ago, and while I did really enjoy the journey of reading this series, I ultimately found 1, 2, or 3 things that ended up really annoying me about the series and why I'm not gonna finish the series. Obviously, I will be doing a spoiler and non-spoiler review, so see the timestamps below if you want to skip ahead. Let's get into it. Okay, so for those of you who haven't read the Kingkiller Chronicles and don't really want to be spoiled, it basically just follows this young man, Koth, in his journey of becoming like the greatest warrior of his land. And the narrative structure is basically this older version of Koth narrating how he became the way he is right now. And so we basically follow his childhood, and also we get a glimpse into how the older version of Koth is doing. So yeah, I really enjoyed the premise of this book. I enjoy the storytelling style. I feel like this series wasn't really that difficult to understand because it prioritized the plot and the prose itself. While I admit that I don't remember exactly whether I love the prose or not, but I definitely remember there being no hitches in terms of prose, and I'm a very picky reader when it comes to prose. As for the world building, again, I don't think that I had any particular issues with the world buildings, very similar to the prose. But I think that the beginning of the book was a lot better in terms of setting the atmosphere, setting the nature aspect of it. But then once we got to the city aspect of it, I just felt like everything just kind of became a little bit more diluted and a little bit more washed out. So that's just one of the first little nitpicks that I start to have with this series. Another thing that I would mention would be the characters, right? Character of Quoth. Something I have to mention is that the series is very divisive among the fandom, and I can completely understand why. I think that when fans love or hate a book, or when they love or hate a character, it's usually the reader's interpretation that's causing this sort of divisiveness. But when it comes to the character of Koth, people either hate him, freaking hate him, or freaking love him. And when the divide is that divisive, I think that's usually the author's fault. And in this case, I really do think it is the author's fault why people interpret Koth in such wildly different ways. Because on paper, I think that Koth is an awesome guy. He's very kind. He's a hero. He's very noble. He works freaking hard, which was my favorite aspect of that character, and I think that was very consistently done. But the reason why I came to hate this character so much was because the author constantly hypes Koth up throughout the series, and it's really kind of irritating because Koth has all these virtues on paper. He's never really wrong in certain situations. He's always in the right. He's always doing things for the right reasons. So there's really no reason for the author to have this need to constantly be shoving down Koth's achievements down my throat and being like, hey, did you see how cool Koth was? Did you see how amazing Koth is? Do you see how noble he is? It's constantly pointing that out can make a reader very, very irritated. And not only that, I feel like Koth was also very self-aware that he was really, really cool, and he actively kind of affirms it throughout the narrative. He constantly is worrying about his image, worrying about how he is perceived by other people, and I didn't really understand that aspect of his personality, considering certain tragedies that had happened in his life earlier in the books. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with trying to look cool. I guess nobody wants to really be humiliated or anything like that. But in certain instances, when he does certain really noble or good things, I think that he's always very self-aware, hyper self-aware about how he looks while he's doing something really, really good, which makes me not really like that character because it makes me feel like all his good deeds are fabricated, right? It just feels like he's being hypocritical and manipulative. And so I think that there's a really good reason why the fandom is so divided on this character, because on paper, yeah, he is doing really good things. Yeah, he's really cool. But then tonally, the author has this character be very obsessed with his reputation and how his image is perceived by people around him. That doesn't feel very authentic because he's not really letting himself open up to anybody, or he's not even opening up to the reader. The author isn't very good at showing us why Koth does the things that he does. And I think that all the major problems of this series is kind of tied to how invincible Koth is and how cool he is, because unfortunately, because he is so calm, cool, and collected, reflected in every single situation that he is. He never really embarrasses himself. He never really finds himself in compromising situations that he's unable to charm himself out of, right? There's no moment where he's actually embarrassed, humiliated, learns a lesson, nothing that he really learns along the way. And I think that all the other issues of this book does relate back to that, because the second issue that I really had with this book was there's no villain. There was really no major plot or major villain in this series. So I think that the villain is kind of introduced very early on in the series, or at least you think that this is going to be the major antagonist, the major conflict, the major pushback for Quoth. But unfortunately, because Quoth never really is self-aware enough to think about why he's doing the things that he's doing, what his future is going to be, there's no moments where Quoth actually self-reflects and thinks about what he's lost in his life and how that's going to motivate him to do better, or to, you don't know what is pushing this guy forward. And that really threw into sharp relief the lack of a pressing plot nor a pressing villain. This series really doesn't have any sort of push to it, because again, Quoth doesn't really seem to have any sort of outside force bogging him down, nor is there an internal force pushing him forward. Also, the mystery that was presented at the beginning of the series doesn't really come back frequently enough to feel like it's the main conflict. And so I would say, yeah, the first issue of the series is that it doesn't really have a plot, an overarching plot at the very least. Secondly, Quoth is basically a Gary Stu. He walks away out of every single situation unscathed. He does find himself in hot water a lot, but weirdly enough, he managed to get out of a single situation by charming himself out of situations, or gaining the admiration of people around him by showing us how cool he is and how everybody else around him admires Quoth. And not only that, he's basically wooing every single girl in the series, and that just kind of really annoyed me, because every single girl, I'm not even kidding you, okay, every single girl in the series ends up being wooed by Quoth. I always point to Sarah J. Maas's books as the epitome of female wish fulfillment, how every single guy in that series ends up falling for the girl, and that's partially why I find Sarah J. Maas's books to be so dumb. I think that Quoth is basically the perfect equivalent to Sarah J. Maas's heroines. You don't find this level of obnoxious male wish fulfillment in other fantasy books. I'm sure there are other books, but I don't think that I've seen another series be this obnoxious in the wish fulfillment. And let's say that we did put all of that aside. The true sin of Quoth's character is that he had no clear goal, basically, and that didn't make any sense to me, because at the beginning, Quoth is established in a very serious way, and so considering what big thing happens to him there, Quoth should have had better reasons for wanting to do the things that he did. Again, he's obsessed with his image, his reputation, and I actually thought that he wanted to build a reputation in order to thwart the big evil, right, at the start of this book. He wants to build allies and to build friendships in order to get an army together and then somehow thwart the big evil. I could have understood that sort of perspective, but again, Quoth never really is self-aware about why he's doing the things that he's doing. We don't understand why he wants to build a reputation. We don't understand why or what he wants from his future. And the few times that he does kind of think about what he wants, it's very fleeting, and he doesn't really do much about it. So yeah, this character has no motivation. He doesn't really have any deep thing to him that made me drawn to him. So yeah, if you take into consideration that I actually pretty much like the prose, the world building, the flow of the series, I like certain aspects of this series, but then you have to understand how much I dislike Quoth for all of the good things to be thrown out the window just like that. If you want to give it a go, if you're able to look past the tonal inconsistencies, which is to say that, Quoth is presented as a good guy, but then he seems manipulative and hypocritical, right? And hypocritical in the sense, his good intentions didn't really seem always noble. It seems like he's doing good things for the attention and the reputation. If you're able to look past that and just appreciate Quoth for what he's actually done, all the good things that he's doing and how badass he is, if you're able to just kind of appreciate that, then I think you could enjoy this series. But for me, I do look at the tonal context, and I couldn't really look past that manipulative sort of painting of Quoth. And I don't think that the author was really intending to do that. I don't think that he really knew that he was doing that when he was painting Quoth to be that way. And that's really my biggest issue with this series. If an author isn't self-aware enough to know how his characters are coming across, It just kind of screams of incompetency to me. And so that's why I feel very comfortable giving this book 2 to 2.5 stars. Everything else was pretty good, but I enjoyed it, right? I've enjoyed the series, but I did end up very annoyed by the character of Quoth and the author's lack of self-awareness. So okay, so now I'm going to go into the spoiler portion of this review. So if you want to hang around and just kind of hear my experience of reading this book chronologically, stick around, you can. There might be spoilers, so just kind of keep an eye out for that. Okay, so basically Quoth at the beginning of the series, he's presented as a child prodigy. He's presented in a very mild-mannered way, and I really liked his relationship with his family. I really liked his relationship with his mentor. That was really, really great. And again, I didn't feel like Quoth was very obnoxious at this point in the story, so I just really liked that. I also felt really bad for him when his entire family is murdered by this villain group. He's basically left orphaned, and he's so much in shock that he goes mute for 3 years, I think. He doesn't go near civilization for years, and I think this was the point in the story where I most empathized for this character. And that's why when Quoth does snap out of it at a certain point, he snaps out of his shock and he remembers that his mentor told him about this magical university. He decides, okay, like, I'm gonna go to this magical university. And I was like, okay, great, like, this guy is getting his life together. On the way to the magical university, he meets a girl called Dana, and I really liked their interaction at the beginning. I thought that was really, really sweet. Once they get to the university though, Quoth says goodbye and he goes to university. And I will say that this is the point in the story that I ended up really annoyed, because this is the point of the story where Quoth suddenly, after 3 years of being mute and being in shock, and up until that point, he's just been portrayed as a very sweet and mild-mannered person, right? Once he gets to the university, he suddenly decides to get a personality and he starts getting very cocky. And I didn't really understand what that was about, because he suddenly decides to be very passive aggressive to people all of a sudden. He gets to university and he wants to try out for the exams, but they basically tell him that he's too young to enroll for university. And so he gets very defensive and angry at the examiners because of that. And I'm like, why are you being so defensive about this? Like, why are you being so snarky about this? The examiners, right, up until this point, they've been basically laughing Quoth out of the room. They've been not very respectful to him. So I can kind of understand why Quoth is, snarky towards them too. But I think that this was supposed to be kind of the author's way of showing how Quoth, again, has a personality and he's not a doormat. But again, that just kind of reminded me a lot of ACOTAR by Sarah J. Maas, because Farah at a certain point in the book gets very passive aggressive towards the character of Tamlin, who is her love interest. And every single time that the love interest would just ask Farah nicely to do something, she would just be so up in arms all of a sudden. And Sarah J. Maas was basically presenting Farah as being quote unquote sassy, when in fact Farah was being straight up rude and passive aggressive. And that was exactly the same thing that happened with Quoth. Whenever he encounters a certain situation when he could just turn the other cheek, he never does. Like, he, again, in the case of the examination, right, he says something really cool or does something really cool and then storms out of the room, and the examiners are just like so, like, they're admiring of that, right? They admire how snarky he is, right? And I was like, what did he really do? Like, he was just kind of passive aggressive and rude. But then the author is painting that situation as Quoth being really cool. And couple that with the fact that he immediately develops an arch enemy at school, it was really petty. Again, the tragedy that Quoth had gone through at the beginning of this book was so sad, I think, for me. And so suddenly him going to school and then him all of a sudden show personality right after that period of time when he was just living in shock. This guy has encountered this tragedy in life, and yet he doesn't know how to prioritize things in his life. Like, dude, your entire family was murdered by these villains. And throughout the book, he is very curious as to who murdered his family, and he is wanting to do research, and that was kind of his main motivation of wanting to get into the school. But once he gets to the school, like, his motivation of wanting to do research on the villains, like, kind of is very half-hearted in my opinion. Like, he doesn't really do anything once he gets to school. So him starting fights with his archenemy, him being so obsessed with his reputation once he gets to school and wanting to look cool, not wanting to be pitied by people, that part I can understand, but I don't understand at the same time, because it's like, if he could get help from his friends, like, that could give him some more time to go and do some research on the villains and whatever. But again, I don't really get that. It's like his energy is so not prioritized on finding the villains that it just kind of made me feel like his motivations were all very petty. This series started as like this adult fantasy, but then it devolved into high school drama by a certain point. And look, if the shenanigans that Quoth finds himself in and the hot water that he lands himself in, if this could have been an opportunity for Quoth to kind of learn something and take away certain life lessons and be like, okay, let's not be petty, let's not get into quarrels, or let's, like, if he's learning stuff along the way, or if it was actually funny, where Quoth is humiliating himself a little bit, then I could have been like, okay, this is entertaining. Okay, like, I could have fun with this. But all the situations that Quoth lands himself in, he always charms himself out of it. And I think one of the major instances that I do remember is when he basically, I think he's framed by his archenemy, and the number of lashings that he gets is like this ridiculously high number, I think. Not only that, he doesn't scream once throughout the lashings. He doesn't express pain. And that's completely, again, in the narrative, he constantly is thinking, like, I'm not going to show weakness in front of all these people. Not only that, by the end of the lashings, his back is bleeding or whatever. And then he's basically like, gets up really cool. Again, this is very consciously done in the narrative. He gets up and he walks away cool as a cucumber, and everybody's like admiring him afterwards, right? Everybody is like giving him respect because of that. And I'm like, the author is constantly shoving down how badass Quoth is down my throat and showing how all the side characters are just like basically starry-eyed for Quoth. It was dumb. I'm just gonna say it was very dumb. Another instance that kind of really did annoy me, all throughout this first book, Quoth never really expresses self-awareness about what has happened to him in regards to his family. Like, the shock that he goes into for 3 years at the start, right? He's basically like a hermit in the woods for 3 years, and he's processing. And so you kind of get the sense that he's formulating, or he's trying to process the grief. You get the sense that things are going through his head. But then after that period, once he gets to the university and starts showing quote-unquote personality, you don't really see him expressing what his plan is, expressing what his motivation is. You don't know how he feels about his family's death, really. Like, I'm sure he feels sad, yeah, but that's as far as the author really goes in showing Quoth's inner feelings. So all throughout the second part of the book, I was like, what the hell is Quoth thinking? And a really good demonstration of this is when there's a certain chapter when Quoth basically gets back to his room and he basically starts crying at the thought of his parents. Now, if you haven't read this book, you would think that's a very normal reaction, right? To expect from a character who has lost his entire family, right? And I wanted to like that chapter, but considering, again, up until that point, Quoth hasn't expressed any grief or he's never really thought about what's happened to him. And so this chapter being just kind of inserted into the middle of the book, where he just kind of crawls into bed, starts crying, and this girl that he befriended, she basically climbs in through the window and she comforts him while he's crying. And this just was very weird for me, because up until this point, Quoth hasn't really expressed his self-awareness. He's never really put down his guard towards anybody, because again, he doesn't really want sympathy, right? He's working his butt off trying to earn his tuition, and he's never asked for help. So him just kind of openly crying in front of this girl felt a little bit out of character for me. But that wasn't even the biggest issue with this book, because that chapter itself, where Quoth himself is crying in bed thinking about his parents, that in of itself stuck out like a sore thumb. It was just so jarring all of a sudden, because this entire book should have been more consistently sprinkled with scenes like this, where Quoth is feeling sadness, where he is expressing his sadness. Like, we should have been able to see a little bit into Quoth's mind, but the fact that this chapter existed, it just kind of demonstrated to me how lacking the rest of the book was in terms of us understanding what was going through Quoth's mind. So that chapter, while it was really, really well done, I think, it did stick out like a sore thumb, and it didn't feel like it belonged in the rest of the book, because the rest of the book was so lacking in helping us understand what Quoth is feeling in terms of like his tragic past. Other things that I would mention about this first book and Quoth's time at the university would be Something else that really did stick out to me was, again, the wooing of the female characters. You would have this very comically over-the-top scene where a girl is being harassed by a guy, and then Quoth basically walks by and he's like, don't bother her, blah blah blah, and he basically sticks up for the girl, and he does it in a really, like, quote unquote, again, cool way. Again, the author is really wanting us to feel like Quoth is really, really cool, right? That's when the girl basically, you know, falls for Quoth, and she's so enamored by him. Every time that she meets him afterwards, she just turns pink at the cheeks, and it was just a very stereotypical portrayal of, you know, women, in my opinion. Like, the women in the series were basically there to be wooed by Quoth. Like, that's really all their function in the book. Aside from the love interest, who's basically there to play hard to get. And I know a lot of people didn't really like that love interest. I don't know, people kept on saying that she was leading him around. And yeah, I guess I understand that. But she was the only character that Quoth allowed himself to be a little bit, like, open to. Like, he was willing to let down his guard around her. So in terms of that function, I did like the love interest. I don't know, I have that very unpopular opinion of thinking that the love interest isn't as bad as other people make it seem. Something else I didn't really like about this first book is the whole magic system, by the way. Maybe it's because I hadn't read a lot of adult fantasy at this point, but I just didn't feel like this stuff was very well explained, to be completely honest with you, which is something that I do kind of notice with fantasy nowadays. Particularly, like, there was this one crazy professor who pushes Quoth off a building, I think, at one point, and I was like, what is the point of all this? When you look at something like the Earthsea cycle, right, the very first book at least, that one I didn't feel at all jarred by, because even if the magic system was abstract and it was kind of like not fully explained, part of the curriculum still had parts where the main character still had to memorize things and where they had to learn certain basics. That gave you a sense that there was a structure or hierarchy in terms of the magic system. It felt like the main character had to memorize certain things at the beginning, but then as time goes on, he's now starting to do a lot of things by intuition, and you get the sense that's more advanced magic. Name of the Wind is just like you're thrown to the wolves right at the beginning and just like, what the hell is going on? Like, it doesn't feel like this character is really moving up in terms of like the learning. And again, pushing someone off a building, like, how does that help? I don't know. It's just like things like that. The shenanigans was very, very weird. And in hindsight, I will say that the major flaws of Name of the Wind actually did seem to come from the fact that it was trying to mimic the Earthsea cycle. And I know these are very shallow elements to compare, but I actually read the Earthsea cycle years after I read Name of the Wind, and so I'm not being flippant or trying to be shallow here when I'm comparing these two books. I just got very strong deja vu vibes back to when I read Name of the Wind while I was reading Earthsea. Except again, Earthsea actually succeeded because even if the plot was similarly meandering to Name of the Wind, Earthsea at least had a protagonist who evolved. The main protagonist, who starts off very pompous and egotistical. He gets humbled very quickly, and the entire book is almost the spiritual journey of the main character trying to rectify his mistakes. Whereas in Name of the Wind, there's really no character development in quotes. There's no humbling of the main character. And also the naming of things, right? The naming of things, I think it was not very successful in Name of the Wind. So yeah, I think that a lot of the issues of Name of the Wind came from the author trying to mimic a lot of the elements and the formulas from the Earthsea cycle, like the naming of things, the meandering plot, the university settings, and then didn't realize that the character journey still had to be there, right? Which Quoth doesn't have. So I think that's pretty much what I have to say about the first book. I think the first book basically ends with Quoth being kicked out of university because of his archenemy. His archenemy is also kicked out of school, I think. Don't remember exactly what the details are, but because, again, I read the series back to back, so the series basically reads like one big book to me, at least in my memory. So now I'm going to discuss the second book. So the second book, I actually enjoyed more in terms of the plot because finally we were away from the school setting in the first book, right? The school setting I could have enjoyed more if it didn't feel like Quoth was constantly having this competition between his peers, and there's also like a lot of petty quarrels, which made that very first book feel very YA. Considering again what kind of tragedy Quoth has endured at the beginning, I just felt like it was very out of character, it was very petty, it just felt very childish. I did not like it. So the second book, once we get away from the school, right, because Quoth has been kicked out, I think I enjoyed it a lot more. I enjoyed the fact that he goes on certain adventures, he starts to build himself up. We get to see other lands, and I don't know, I just liked the second book more in terms of like what Quoth was exploring. But I will say, as a second book in the series, it really went nowhere, because by the end of that second book, I don't think that Quoth learned anything important, at least in terms of the villains or in terms of like the overarching plot. And I think, in the end, he basically comes back to the university, and if it's basically like nothing's really happened between the first and second book, right? So yeah, the second book just seemed very useless, despite me enjoying it a lot more. And I think the second book threw into sharp relief how much I disliked the wooing of the female characters. The first book was kind of annoying. Yes, it was kind of obnoxious how every single girl just kind of gets wooed by Quoth, but the second book introduces sex. Every girl basically wants to sleep with him in that second book. And in a certain scene where he's basically, I think he's in a certain culture, his mentor is a woman, and he basically is training with her, and he suddenly gets a hard on while they're training. And I just found that really disgusting. Like, I don't know, like the female, the mentor, she's like this badass, right? She takes no nonsense. And then suddenly she sees the hard on and she's like, do you want to have sex? Like, and I was like, again, that's where the series just feels very wish fulfillment-y. It's like the fact that the woman is just like, she's like this badass and whatever, but then like she's like willing to have sex with Quoth, right? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was a cultural thing, but that was one of the first instances I was just like, ugh, right? Like, I was just like, okay, sure. And then the definitive thing that really annoyed me about the second book, right? Okay, so this was a thing that probably really derailed my enjoyment of the series, despite, Quoth was annoying, but I wasn't really fully derailed yet. But the sex fairy. Okay, let's talk about the sex fairy. This was where I feel like Quoth's two-faced demeanor really popped out for me, because before he meets this sex fairy, right, he's with this group of travelers and they're traveling, and then he basically gets nabbed by the sex fairy and gets taken into a realm. And the myth is basically that if you get nabbed by this sex fairy, you end up having sex with her to the point that, you die. Basically, Quoth gets nabbed, but then this really, really, really cheesy moment comes along when okay, so he starts having sex with her basically, and at a certain point, the fairy looks into his face, or I think either she just looks at his facial expression, or she's able to see into his mind. Whatever it is, she looks at him, and she suddenly is so moved by Quoth and how noble he is that she basically decides not to kill him because he's so noble and he's so pure-hearted. And I was just like in this scene, like, what? Like, I was like, what? And not only that, look, this just really highlighted Quoth's two-sided nature to me, because again, up until this point, he's just constantly been snarky. He's put up this wall. He's never really put down his wall towards anybody. He's constantly shown to be invincible, but then suddenly he meets this sex fairy, and suddenly he's acting like this pure-hearted boy. He's opening his heart to the sex fairy, and he's basically playing those aspects of himself up. And I didn't really understand if he was doing this on purpose, or if it's the author trying to show that Quoth really is pure-hearted on the inside. It was just a really funny instance of just like the sex fairy is about to murder Quoth, but then she just looks into his face or into his heart, and she's like, you're the most pure-hearted person that I've met. Again, up until this point, the myth is that she's basically murdered all the guys by having sex with him. And it was just really, really funny that she's like, of all these like hundreds of thousands of guys that I've slept with, like, you're the one person that I'm willing to let go. That was the point that I was just kind of like laughing about that. But there's another thing that I found absurd about this scene. So Quoth is spared, but he's decided to stay with the sex fairy for a little bit and have sex with her, and it's just basically wish fulfillment. Let's just face it, okay? It's just basically wish fulfillment. It's really dumb. And then right before he leaves, I think that the fairy takes him to like this forest, a part of the forest, and I don't know, the world building gets really, really bad in that instance. It's just like, what the hell is happening? Because like he gets to this tree thing, and the tree basically, I think, tells him some sort of prophecy. I don't remember the details, but I remember being like very confused by that. That was just really, really random. And then soon afterwards, Quoth basically tells the sex fairy, okay, it's been really nice being in this realm with you. You've been great to me, but I really do have to go and I need to do something. And the sex fairy is heartbroken. Like, again, from that very first moment, she's just like, you're so pure, you're so innocent, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, sure. And so when Quoth basically says, like, I really have to leave, will you let me leave? He is being very empathetic towards her. He is being very appreciative towards her. So that was really, really nice. But The thing that really pissed me off about Quoth the most throughout the series is the moment when he decides to leave this fairy. Again, he leaves her with this promise, like, I promise I will return, like, thank you so much for everything, but like, I promise I'll return. And he seems like he's basically making a promise to a lover, which I'm sure he's not, but the way that he's speaking is very sweet towards her. So imagine how pissed off I was when literally he leaves this realm, and within 2 or 3 pages, or maybe 4 pages, he finds his companions again. His companions are in this tavern or whatever, and Quoth walks in and they're like, oh my gosh, you're alive, blah blah blah, like, I thought the sex fairy like killed you or whatever. And Quoth is like yeah, I did have sex with this fairy, but like, I wish I remember exactly what it was about, but I remember being very pissed off by his response, because again, he just seemed to be saying goodbye to this fairy in a way that he felt bad about it. But then 2 to 3 pages later, he's suddenly talking about the sex fairy, and he's talking about like how he like conquered her or whatever. Like, I know he didn't really say it in that way, but he was basically bragging about the fact that he had sex with this sex fairy, when 2 or 3 pages ago, again, he seemed like this very pure-hearted soul who wouldn't brag about anything, right? He takes this almost very private moment and just uses it as like fodder to brag about his conquest, like his sexual conquest. And that's the part that really disgusted me. It was just like the perfect embodiment of what I didn't like about the series. The fairy just uncharacteristically deciding not to kill Quoth because she finds him so special, right? He's just a special snowflake. And Quoth, he's acting very vulnerable towards her all of a sudden. I don't know whether it was because he wanted to act up on what she said about him, or because he genuinely is feeling vulnerable towards her and he wants to kind of for once put down all the burdens in his life, which I could understand. But when he's leaving, he's again acting very broken up and apologetic and sweet towards the fairy, who is very sad about the fact that he's leaving, right? You're like, okay, he's trying to be genuine towards her. He is trying to be vulnerable. Okay, let me try to look past the fact that the fairy found him so special, right? Quoth is such a Gary Stu. I'm going to overlook all of that. But then literally 2 pages or 3 pages later, he's starting to like brag about the fact that he basically has sex with a sex fairy, and it's just a very disgusting thing to do, in my opinion. It's just very, very tone deaf to the point that I really couldn't buy into the moments where he is being vulnerable, where he is being actually sincere. And I think that's kind of a big problem I had with the series. Hi, quick insert here. I'm editing this review right now, and I'm realizing that I didn't do a very good job of explaining why I'm so disdainful of this scene. I skipped a few nuances that I probably should mention. The first of which is that Quoth in the scene is actually R-worded by the fairy. The fairy not only kidnaps Quoth, she also puts him into a trance, and she kind of increases his libido, and then she kind of basically forces him or compels him to have intercourse with her. And so Quoth does not consent to this intercourse, right? He's not really fully consciously there, which basically is R-wording, right? And so, yeah, I do definitely want to kind of acknowledge these transgressions by this fairy before I go about explaining why I still felt angry on her behalf. Again, it's a little bit weird for me to be defending a fairy that R-worded somebody or tried to kill somebody, right? So I understand it's a little bit weird. But again, there's a little bit of nuance here that still makes the scene very emotionally manipulative and tone deaf. Because again, the part where things get a little bit iffy is that even though Quoth is initially R-worded by the fairy, he does actually decide to stay with the fairy afterwards and even asks her to teach him sexual techniques, which implies that he kind of almost liked having sex with the fairy. And it feels a little bit weird for me to say that again, because when someone is R-worded, I don't really want to propagate this idea that they enjoy having consent taken away. But I don't think that there was anything in the narrative that suggested that this was Stockholm Syndrome, or that Quoth was staying with a fairy in order to make her not kill him. Because again, I think that Quoth was in a position of power at this point, and he could have easily left at any point. And so considering those things, I think it's pretty fair fair for me to kind of assume that Quoth and the fairy become friends at a certain point. And that's why I actually started to kind of almost enjoy their interaction at a certain point. Yes, the fairy was treating Quoth like a special snowflake. There's this very emotionally manipulative scene after he decides to spare her life when he suddenly sits down and starts crying about his parents. And I could tell that the author was trying to make Quoth look really vulnerable and sweet and whatever to the fairy. And I was like, okay, this is a really transparent scene of the author trying to manipulate our emotions. But I kind of decided to let this go because, at least for the first time in a very long time, Quoth was actually showing some emotion. Up until this point, Quoth really hasn't put down his guard towards anybody, not even to his friends who are, you know, pretty amiable and they don't wish him harm. Quoth always puts up a guard with everybody. And so the fact that he was putting down his guard with the fairy, like, I was like, okay, like, he's trying to be vulnerable here. But then only 3 pages after he leaves the fairy, he starts to portray the fairy as having been conquered by him in the next scene. And this was purely done to kind of boost his reputation and make himself look better. And this I found really distasteful because, in my opinion, Quoth actually did befriend the fairy by the time that he left. They were both being vulnerable. They were helping each other. And so, considering that relationship, it's actually pretty gross to portray a friend in that way because, considering you weren't acting this way around her, why is it that you're acting this way when you're not around her, right? Like, why are you putting on such a two-faced sort of demeanor where you're showing respect to the fairy and where you're acting like your true self, but then behind her back, you're suddenly being like so boastful and like you wouldn't do this in front of her, so why are you doing this behind her back? And that's where I didn't really love the portrayal of women in the series, because not only are they objects to be wooed into submission or admiration, you can also kind of tell that the author thinks that the basic act of human decency of saving women from harassment or kidnapping is something to be praised. Yes, in this fantasy world, maybe all the men in this world are just trash. So, quote, saving women or respecting women is something to be gushed about. But it's really the sense of self-satisfaction that oozes out of this narrative that really puts me off in the end, especially considering the bar for villains is so low here as well. All the antagonists in this series are just so comically dumb, nonsensical, or over the top that it kind of gets old being told how awesome Quoth is when he puts these villains in their place. Like, you would have this example of a guy harassing a woman, and then, you know, Quoth decides to put him in his place, and then the woman shows admiration for Quoth. Or in another instance, you would have this arch enemy who has absolutely no depth beyond wanting to harass Quoth. And in another instance, there's this rich patron. This patron is saved by Quoth, but then he decides to kind of turn around and kind of backstab Quoth. And another instance would be, I guess, this professor from the university, right, who kind of has it out for Quoth unfairly. And so it's really easy for Quoth to kind of outwit or kind of put these fools into their place. There's really no gray morals here. Like, we only have no choice but to cheer for Quoth. And that gets really exhausting, being told just how morally right Quoth is all the time when the bar is so low for the villains here. The author tries way too hard to morally justify Quoth. And the wooing of the female characters, in my opinion, is kind of this... It kind of fits into that category. There's this sense of moral self-righteousness oozing out of this narrative. And so when we come to this scene with this fairy where Quoth is showing his vulnerable side to her, but then behind her back, he kind of acts very sleazy by portraying this fairy as being conquered and kind of liking being conquered, right? I'm not trying to justify any of the fairy's actions because, again, she did R-word Quoth and she did try to kill him, right? But I'm just saying, just because she did those things doesn't make Quoth look any better when he goes behind her back and, you know, portrays her in that way, right? Especially after he put on this, like, innocent face in front of her. And I think that's kind of the part that just kind of made me really, really annoyed with the scene. And it's just the hypocrisy, I think, and the sort of emotional manipulation by the author that's just really, really putting me off with this entire series. So, but on a final note, I think the fact that this series ends on such a random not even a random, just ends on a very nothing cliffhanger. Quoth basically goes through this entire journey, and he's really not really had any consequential things happen to him. He's so intelligent, and he's so like charismatic and charming and wily that every single situation Quoth manages to charm himself out of the situation, or the author has a side characters be so charmed by Quoth's daring and charisma that they just kind of let him off the hook. There's no moral lessons to be taken away. There's no plot tension to be taken away because there's no villain in the story. And there's also no internal journey for Quoth because he's never really self-reflective about the fact that he lost a lot at the beginning of the series. There are only 1, 2, or 3 instances where he actually is being vulnerable. As a result, it's like you don't know what is the point, right? Like, what's the point? Like, you presented this great conflict and this great tragedy at the beginning of the series, but the main character that you're presenting throughout the series doesn't seem to be affected by that tragedy, or they don't seem to be related to that tragedy because he's so preoccupied with everything that's so vain and narcissistic. So there's no inner conflict, there's no outer conflict, there's no plot conflict. But I will say, I just want to end on a more positive note, because up until this point, the things that I have been griping about have been all in regards to the younger version of Quoth. But the ironic thing is, I really did like the older version of Quoth. He's like this downtrodden innkeeper. He's not a celebrity like he was in like the younger days. He seems very mellowed out. It seems like he went through a lot. And I was hoping that we could kind of get a glimpse into what exactly happened in his past for him to seem so somber and seem so sad, because unfortunately by the second book we never really see exactly what happened to Quoth for Quoth to end up as a downtrodden innkeeper. But again, I still have to say I did like those chapters where he was just kind of chill, he's just kind of telling his story, and I just really did feel a lot of sympathy for him because he definitely seemed like he's gone through a lot. Don't know what it is, but I still felt bad for him. I wanted to see more of that is what I'm trying to say. What else do I have to talk about? Okay, so really, this is the last thing that I want to discuss. When it comes to criticism, I've seen criticism towards this series be deflected by people saying Quoth is obnoxious because he's meant to be obnoxious, or Quoth is meant to be cocky and he's meant to be unlikable because it's almost like Quoth is trying to kind of make himself look better. But where I don't really agree with that, because I don't think that the author himself was being very self-aware about the fact that he was making Quoth to be so unlikable and cocky. Because look, if you read something like the Bartimaeus trilogy by Jonathan Stroud, the author is extremely self-aware about how pompous the main character is. Even the love interest and the side characters around the main character are constantly side-eyeing the main character because he's progressively becoming a cocky, arrogant little twerp. That plays for a lot of comedy and still a really good moral sort of takeaway. But again, in the Kingkiller Chronicles, there's no one character or any character, not even the author, who's just like pointing out that Quoth is being kind of really full of himself, because constantly he would have this imagery of Quoth like slinging his cloak around his shoulders and like walking into the sunset with this really cool stride. And I don't think that's self-awareness at all. Like I think you're meant to think that Quoth is really, really cool and not actually cocky. And that's where I have to say that, I really don't like this series, because when an author is unable to portray their characters in an objective light, and they're not able to restrain themselves from trying to push this character onto the readers, that's when I get very annoyed, right? Like, you're trying to emotionally manipulate me into actually liking your character, when in fact, you're really giving me no subtlety at all. Something that I really have to kind of mention when it comes to my particular reading taste is I really enjoy flawed protagonists. I really like it when a character is so flawed and so annoying, but the author is extremely self-aware about that. I really like it when the author or the side characters constantly point out to the main character that they're being a piece of shit, and therefore the main character has to grow and evolve. So if Quoth was just like this asshole at the beginning of the series, I could have really like bought into that if the author was acknowledging those flaws. But the fact that the author did not acknowledge the flaws in character of Quoth throughout the series was what ultimately let the series down. I wish that Quoth was actively a dick in order for him to learn a lesson by the end of the series. But again, I don't think that he's learning anything throughout the series, which is what ultimately made me really annoyed by the series. So Yeah, my voice is completely gone at this point, as usual. Let me know what you thought about this book, and toodles.
어제는 별이 졌다네 나의 가슴이 무너